All right, kudos to you last session of the day, people. I really appreciate that. I'm really happy that I got to speak at the last session of the day. As you can tell from my accent, I'm not from your part of the world. I did attend the SQL Day last year in Wasla, and I learned how to say Wasla, which is major accomplishment given how bad my Polish is. That in punch keys is about the extent of it. Hopefully your English is all great so that I don't have to worry about that. So I wanted to go ahead and get started and talk about Azure Synapse. So Azure Synapse is Microsoft's latest and greatest new things, and it really is a neat product because it encompasses so much functionality. I know that there's still some people who are mistakenly thinking that, yeah, it's that new SQL data warehouse. And while that was what Microsoft first announced when Synapse was released in November of 2019, it has a whole lot more interesting components to it, which I'd like to talk about today. So I wanted to thank to the sponsors. Without them, this great event wouldn't be possible. A little bit about me. My name is Ginger Grant. I am a Microsoft Data Platform MVP and a Microsoft certified trainer. And I wrote a book on test prep for machine learning for an exam that is now expired. I was at SQL Days last year in 2019, and I had planned on showing up this year again because I really liked the event. I'm a consultant at Desert Isle Group, and I live in the desert. So a great place to reach me is at desertisleSQL.com, as I'm on Twitter way too much. All right. Let's talk about Azure Synapse. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what it is. And then in the brief hour, I'm going to chock this full of demos and try to show as much functionality as I can. So what can you do with Azure Synapse anyway? Well, you can use it to query flat files. You can use actual TSQL and use it to not only query flat files, but to persist them and create a virtual database. It also contains components to incorporate ADF. Azure Data Factory is included within Azure Synapse, and we'll go ahead and take a look at the pipelines that you can create in there. Of course, my favorite element of Azure Machine of Azure Synapse is the fact that it incorporates machine learning with both Azure Machine Learning and with Spark's own Apache Spark solutions. It is a competitor to Databricks. I did a session at Past Summit on that. So if you have any questions about the differences between Azure Databricks and the functionality of Spark SQL, please, when I get to that section, please ask. I bet you I have an answer for you. Then we'll talk about what most people think about Azure Synapse Analytics is data warehousing. We'll talk about that and persisted pools. And then lastly, we'll wrap it up and talk about Power BI integration. So what is Azure Synapse Analytics? Well, it's really an end-to-end workspace. It's got a lot of different elements within it. It's got everything from orchestrate. Microsoft now has renamed this as integrate. You still get that same concept. And it incorporates and sits on top of an Azure Data Lake Gen 2. As a matter of fact, you can't even create a machine learning workspace without creating an Azure Data Lake Gen 2 account or linking to one that you already have, because it's required that you have a primary account for creation of a Azure Synapse Analytics workspace. I'm not going to today go through creating an Azure Synapse workspace because honestly, it's super easy. There's no hidden tricks. It does take the prerequisite 10 minutes. But it's really a brainless thing to do. I'm sure you can find countless videos on how to do it. And I hope you take the time to create your own session in Azure Synapse, and I'll give you a whole bunch of reasons as to what you can do with it. Of course, it also includes the data warehousing functionality. It is the new version of Azure SQL Data Warehouse. Azure SQL Data Warehouse is actually GA. I know that most of the stuff that I'm talking about today is not considered a generally released product yet, but the data warehousing components have been released, and are fully supported, and that is not considered a pre-release product by any stretch of the imagination. The rest of it is. It also includes Apache Spark. Now, the difference between the Apache Spark that is included within Synapse and what's included in Databricks is that Microsoft is actually using the non-proprietary open source stuff. How about that? And is using Apache Spark open source libraries to support and include within Azure Synapse. And of course, because it's the latest, it's also a really cool, fun product. Power BI is fully integrated within Azure Synapse as well. So you can, use it within Synapse, and we'll take a look at that. So why Azure Data Lake Gen 2? What's it? What do you need to do with it? Why does anybody care? Why is it even part of Synapse? Well, the hierarchical namespace means that the Azure Data Lake Gen 2 is a place where you might be building a data lake house. And Microsoft actually hopes that you will. The idea of Synapse is that it is a place that brings together both your structured big data, i.e. your data warehouse, plus a whole bunch of your unstructured data, any video files you might have, audio files from the call center, or random PDF documents, or just flat files that you might have with maybe some IoT data or accounting data. Whatever you happen to have, Azure Data Lake Gen 2 is the repository that Microsoft expects that you will put that kind of information in. And let's face it, not everybody needs a curated data warehouse, because it doesn't fit every need, and it has to be organized very well to be able to support the queries that are demanded of it. So some people aren't happy with the way it's organized. That's fine. We have all that raw data. Let's use that and query that too. Of course, with Azure Data Lake, you also, if you wish, can use it to house HDFS or Hadoop clusters. You can run that as well. And it's a great place to store any and all of your logging. There is a ton of logging that is available now within Azure, both from a security perspective, absolutely, as well from your different SQL logs, and those include the ones that you might have within Azure Synapse. So those are the kinds of things that you might have in Azure Data Lake Gen 2. I can tell you that I've had, that even though it's a preview product, I have put customers in Azure Synapse Analytics. And one of the things that they're using it for is their operational data store. I was working with a company, and they have data in Salesforce, in Workday, and they have this and GP. And so instead of putting that together somewhere else so that they can knit it all together, they're doing that within Azure Data Lake Gen 2. And that's where their repository for gathering all their stuff is. So that is their effective operational data store. It's a great place for that. All right, querying flat files in serverless pools. So this is basically the TSQL on flat files part of Synapse. You may have seen this. It allows you to do data analysis of flat files using TSQL, not SQLite, SQL Baby, no, TSQL. So you can write CTEs and the whole 9 yards. And one of the cool things about this is you can use you can persist the flat files, make queries on them, and make a logical data warehouse. So let's say that I've got a whole bunch of data, like from my operational data store, and I want to join them together. That's all, columnar data. So I can do that, create my own logical data warehouse, persist that to Azure Data Lake, and then maybe read it in with Power BI if I don't have a ton of data. Or I could put it into a data warehouse using polybase. So it's a great tool, and we'll take a look at that as well. Now, the thing about the way that Synapse is structured is it's really a bunch of different pools. And the pool that the SQL is in, that where you do TSQL on flat files, they used to call that SQL on demand, but it is now called a serverless pool, which is funny because it's in the cloud. So it's somebody else's server. But anyway, it is called a serverless pool. You do not provision this. You actually have no way of provisioning it. So if you want a faster one, sorry, you can't have one. It comes in one speed, and that is the speed that it is provided. So the cool thing about it is, though, is you are not charged for it running. So if you leave it running all weekend, don't worry about it. You are charged when you use it. And it's $5 a terabyte for querying. So yeah, it's not going to kill you. And so you can't turn it off. So it's a good thing that it's not terribly expensive. So with that, let me go ahead and actually bring in my demo where we can look at stuff that I have within Azure Synapse in a serverless pool. I want to make this bigger so you all can see it, because I know it's sometimes hard and you all don't have these giant monitors that I do. So let's take a look at my data. Now I've got, I'll back this up. I've got a linked server here. And what this is these are links to different data sources that I have. Oh, by the way, I can also link to a Cosmos DB. So I can query that within my TSQL pools as well. So I've got a whole bunch of information that I can gather from my data within my linked space workspace. So I've got a number of different Azure data lake storage here. So one is required because it's primary, but hey, you know, one's never enough. So I have created here it's a data lake house. And this is my operational data, the data that I have curated and am ready to actually load into Power BI. And then I've decided, you know, this old stuff, I can kind of wait for it for a while, and I don't really care to do a whole lot with it. So I'm going to put it into a different Azure Data Lake Gen Store, one that is not so pricey. It's cold store, it's locally redundant, it's not huge, so that I can put all of my old data there. So that's what I have done. So I've got my old data here in my archive folder. So just some old files and ready for the new stuff, which I don't have in here. But let's take a look at my data that I have within my operational data lakehouse. Now I've got some curated files. I've got raw, I've got some reference, and I've got some unstructured. Let's take a look at my curated stuff, because naturally it's pretty. I got a Power BI model in here. Come on. And I've got a bunch of tables. Hey, let's take a look at them. To take a look at what I've got within my flat files, I can just do a right click, and then I can do a new SQL script and say, give me the top 100 rows. And then I can go ahead and run it. Ooh, it's in use. Well, let me grab another file. That's odd. I've got lots of files here, though, so we can take a look at some other ones. I know I've got some raw ones for sure that we can take a look at. So let's take a look at this. And I go ahead and run this. Wow. I can't believe that I'm having these kinds of issues. I guess I have not prayed to the data gods enough. I know I've got a ton of data in here, though, so this is really kind of strange. I'm going to take a look at my reference data. Hopefully I've got something in there that I can use. Let's look at state codes. And see if I can take a look at these. Wow, having some problems with my demos here. Wonderful. Well, let's take a look and see if I can't access some of the other curated files that I have here. If this one doesn't work, I have another one that I will. Wow. I don't know why it's in use with another process, because generally speaking, I swear that I had no issues looking at my data at all. But what I can do with this particular data is I can use it to put it into a data lake house. Let me see if I've got another Power BI instance available, excuse me, another instance of Synapse so we can take a look at my data here. And here I've got a SQL data warehouse that's got tables within it. And I need to go ahead and start that for my next demo. And I also have some Power BI data. And I've got some linked data as well. Hopefully this data will like me a little bit better. Let's see. Well, I'm going to have to blow off that part of the demo now, but when I'm not giving demos, it works just great. I can query it, no problems. Let's go on and move on to the next part of this so that we can cover the part that I can actually get to work. Next, I'm going to be talking about integration pipelines. So Microsoft has designed this as Azure Synapse is to be a location where you can get your data processed. So if you have it in a raw form and you want to curate it, put it into a data warehouse, you can go ahead and do that. And you can do that through an integration pipeline, which is Azure Data Factory incorporated into SQL Server, into Azure Synapse. As a matter of fact, if you go look up the code pages for ADF, you'll notice that it says at the top in the Azure documentation that this also works for Azure Synapse. There are a couple of things, though, that are a little bit different. You can use it to call notebooks, and you cannot do that, obviously, within your standard ADF calls. And it uses a Spark integration runtime to run. And there is one thing you cannot do with it. You cannot do lift and shift SSIS packages. That is not supported. All right, let's take a look at this at my code now, and hopefully this demo will be fine. And I'm going to pull up my integration runtime in this one. All right, so I've got several pipelines that I have created. So pipelines are relatively easy to create for those of you who aren't terribly familiar with ADF. It's pretty much works the same way. I can create different resources with this, and I can go ahead and generate a pipeline that'll automatically create for me. Let's take a look at one that I created called convert a parquet file from employee data. Now, one thing about different file formats that you might have within your Azure Data Lakehouse, a parquet file is a type of file that is part of the Apache open source collective, and it is a file that actually is a columnar-based file, similar to files within a SQL database if you've got a column store index on it, or similar to how data is stored within Analysis Services Tabular. And if you've got data stored in this way, it can be compressed. So if you're doing long-term storage, it makes sense to store it as a parquet file because it'll actually decrease the amount of space that you need. You can actually take a file down from like 0.5 terabyte to a couple of 100 gigs if it's the right kind of data, if you've got a lot of sparse data. So this is definitely something to think about doing. So it's very simple to create this. I'm going to go ahead and open this up. I've got a pipeline here that I've created, and my source is a data set called employee. We can go ahead and look that up. And I've got this in my Acme Ops data lakehouse. And I'm going to go ahead and test this connection. And it says that it's successful. It is pipe delimited. It went ahead and selected that for me. I, of course, have the option of comma delimit, but this happens to be a pipe delimited file, so that's what I'm showing. And let's take a look at the schema. So the schema has been imported for me, and it automatically is assuming that everything is string. Now, if I was putting this into a database, I would probably change it. but I'm putting it into another flat file format, so it doesn't really matter that it's referencing everything as string. So when I do this, it's going to take this data and it's going to convert it. Now, the next step that it is going to do, if we go back to this pipeline, is I need to have what's called a sink. And a sink is just a fancy name for my data source. So my data destination. My data destination is where I'm going to sink this into. And I'm going to sink this into an ARC, to a parquet file. And it's pretty easy to do that. All I did was click on new and I selected parquet. So not terribly difficult to do. There's a number of different file formats that you could possibly select within the ones that are available to you. And I selected parquet. So when I open this file doesn't exist and I want it to go to a location called Acme Archive. So if I open up my connection here, you can see that I am looking to go to my cold storage Azure Data Lake file and put it there. I can use my Azure subscription to generate this, or I can enter it manually. Honestly, I did enter it manually. And let's go ahead and test the connection, make sure that this is working fine. Great. And so all I want to do is I want to convert a file. Now, one thing about Azure Synapse, I have not incorporated it yet in this account, but recently it does have source control. So I can go ahead and set up a code repository here and then incorporate all of my data with either, I'm going to cancel this too, with either Azure DevOps or with GitHub, so that I have the ability to make sure that my data is secure. And that includes all elements that I might be testing within Azure Synapse. So if I want to run my pipeline, I would just run the debug. And if we take a look at the pipelines, we can take a look at all the time that this is run. So I've manually ran copy to parquet and create parquet a little while ago. Let's go ahead and take a look at what these look like, just so you get an idea of what's within them. So it's showing you that the destination completed, and I can take a look at what happened, source, destination, say okay. If I examine this further, it shows you the data read, the data written, the number of rows, and the throughput. So I don't know how long this one is going to take, but I do have the ability of doing that. So when I have converted it, if I look at my Azure Storage Explorer, let's not do that. Actually, I want to look at it within Synapse. Or actually within Azure. So if I take a look at my cold storage, I can see from within my containers, my archive folder, my employees, and here is my employee parquet file. So I can, when I look at this though, it's not real easy to see. I can just see the versions. I can see and when it was created and when it was updated. So this is what I can do within Azure Synapse. Now, one thing that is really kind of neat, I can make these, of course, much more complicated. I can use them to take machine learning code and run it within my application, which makes it a whole lot more creative and allows for a whole bunch of additional functionality, because a lot of times when there are things that you might want to do in ADF that it's just not that good at. For example, if you're trying to do a lot of XML parsing, not so good. You might find that it might be better to use Spark to do that. Matter of fact, there are a number of companies that are moving to Spark to do their ETL because people have more skills in Python and they find it easier to use. So I don't know if that's the environment that you find yourselves in, But if you are looking at perhaps another thing that I got into a little while ago was I had a file that some of the N characters, not all of them, but some of them were not, had invalid characters at the end instead of what I was expecting. It was so much easier to clean that up in Python than it would be to mess with that within ADF. So you do have options of being able to put notebooks within your pipeline runs within Synapse. So you've got options. You don't have to. You can just use all the wizards you want to and never do pipelines at all. But if in turn and move your data into it so that you can use polybase to load data within your data warehouse. So you've got a number of options available to you, and using the pipelines within Azure Synapse can be extremely helpful and also automate it. So you can do everything that you need to do with big data from within Synapse. Okay. Now let's take a look at doing machine learning with Spark Pools. So machine learning with Spark Pools is basically used for machine learning or ETL. There are 3 languages that are supported within Synapse: Python, .NET, and Scala. So Microsoft, of course, is the only one who is supporting a Spark version of .NET. So if you are familiar with C# and you want to write your code in C#, great, you can write your Spark code within that. It is very similar functionality to Databricks, but it is not exactly the same. And the reason why is Databricks is using a proprietary version of Spark, which is faster. They're also using a slightly newer version of Spark, as they are using Spark 3.0, and within Spark, we're using 2.4. So it is notebook-based, as you might expect, and it allows you to do a whole bunch of machine learning components within your Synapse environment. So let's take a look at doing that. All right. So within my workspace, I'm going to go ahead and import some code. So I'm going to go ahead and say add new resource. And I want to import. And I want to import code Synapse. And I'm going to go ahead and import my classification. Now I'll do decisions. I'll do, I guess this one, classification. So what this particular machine learning notebook does is, as you might guess, imports a whole lot of different libraries that I'm going to use within my machine learning experiment. And the goal of my experiment is to determine who is more likely, if with a given set of data, to import that, to take that data and put it within a and to get a loan out of it. So actually, I need to switch accounts right here. Yeah, and I'm going to do the same thing here and import my regression algorithm. I'm just doing this based on the location only matters to me because I need to migrate a file, and I know where the file is. All right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to import, actually, and I'm going to import a pipeline, classification, import logistic regression, and then use a tokenizer, and then do Spark's import. Actually, I'm going to pull in another one. Great. There we go. So this is my bank classification. So I'm going to go ahead and run this. And what this is going to do is this is going to start my Synapse pool. Now, unlike the data warehouse components, Synapse pools, they stop when you are not using them. So I'm going to go ahead and start this running. And then let's take a look at our different pools that we have created. So if I look at my manage section here, I can see that I have my SQL pools that I was telling you about earlier that are automatically built in, and it's always online. I also have within this account, I have a Apache Spark pool, and I call it Med Synapse pool because it is a medium pool. I have the ability of changing the pause settings right now. Of course, it's running now, so I don't want to do it. I can change the number of minutes idle before it stops. So it will never stop if it's in motion, if somebody is using it. But right now it is set for pausing after 15 minutes. I could disable it, but why would I do that? It's helping me out with this. So I can change that if I want to. I can also change the types of pools that I'm using within my environment. One thing that's kind of neat about Synapse is everything is separate from the data and the compute. That means if I decide this medium Synapse pool is too expensive or I want something that's way more powerful, I can create a new pool and I can run my code on that. It's not important that the pool be tied to the code. I can change that at any time, increasing the resources that I have available to me, allowing me to do a whole lot more with my data should I wish to do so. Okay, so let's see if my Spark pool is running. It's not running yet. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a look at the data and I'll just walk you through this so that you get an idea of what the kinds of machine learning that you can do with Azure Synapse. The other thing that I will say is that it does take about 4 minutes to start up a pool, which is similar to what it starts up in Databricks. So that part's really no different. So let's take a look at what this code is doing so you can see how you would make this fly. So what this is going to do is it's going to create a session, and it's called, the application is going to be called builder app name. Oh, great, that finished. So I'm going to go ahead and call this the marketing data set. Now I'm going to load some data that I have within, very lazy of me, the root of my data lake. So let's take a look at that within Storage Explorer. And here is the file that I'm going to want to gather. So this is in my Synapse 11 data lake. So I'm going to change my access here to Synapse 11 data lake. And it is in root. And I don't have a relative path. I'll just go ahead and give it one. I'll put it in raw. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to read that in. So what I'm going to do is, this is my account name. So I've aliased that out here, DFS core, windows.net, which is what you have to connect to a data lake. And then my account name is here, and my relative path, and then the file name, which is bank CSV. So I'm going to go ahead and read this file that I have in this particular location. Just make sure I spelled Synapse right. So this is the schema for my data. You can see this is executing with 2 executors and 16 cores. Spark is a massively multi-threaded application so that it will cut up the data into chunks and run it over as much as it possibly can. So I've read my data in. I can go ahead and print my schema. And I can see that I've got age, job, marital, education, default, balance, a number of fields. And what I'm trying to figure out is whether or not they're going to buy a certificate of deposit. So I'm going to show the first 5 here. And then I'm going to do a group by, and I'm going to count the clients. So I'm going to basically see how many records that I have. And I've got the number of people who said that they would buy a certificate of deposit and the number of people who said no. And I can go ahead and display this in a pretty way. I can use charts. This is very similar to how Azure Data Studio works. If you saw a Warwick's session yesterday, you'll have gotten a great eyeful out of how all of that works. So what I'm going to do is now I want it to describe the different integer types. So of course, not all of my fields, as you look here, are integer. Matter of fact, a number of them are string. And I have problems with dealing with that. So I'm going to figure out how I'm going to separately deal with my integers versus my text data. So I'm also going to count the different items in the group. So I'm going to look at what the different values are. And here I can see that I'm looking at the job. So what profession people said that they had. And I'm looking at the different counts for that. Well, with machine learning, I really want to make these into categories. So I'm going to do something called one-hot encoding. And with one-hot encoding, I'm going to take these individual elements that are in the one file of job, and I'm going to flip it to see, I'm going to create a column for admin, blue collar, and entrepreneur, and basically do yes or no. And I'm going to put that in a vector. And so I'm going to create vectors that contain numerical representations of my data. And when I do, I'm going to have my index. My index is the classification at the end, which is basically going to say, what is this? Are they going to get a certificate of deposit or not? So my yes or no value. And that is going to be my label. So I'm going to do my little transforming step here to transform my data so that I can do this machine learning analysis on it. One thing that's important to remember with Spark is you load everything into data frames. And I have loaded my data into data frames. And if I look at the first 5, I notice that all of these happen to have bought a certificate of deposit, but hey, it's just the first 5. So I'm going to look at my index features here. So all of the items that I put into vectors and take a look at these. And I'm going to transform my bank data frame and show the first 5 of my totally reformatted data. I went from something that you could actually read to a whole bunch of numbers just to get the data into the format that the algorithm would read it. So then I'm going to split my data into training data sets. So 80% of this is going to be training, and the remaining 20 is going to be test. And you can see this split here because I have roughly 11,000. So you get it, it's close. And I'm going to take a look at the first 5 samples. And then see which ones are yes or no. And I did the training and the test. Got some more no's here, which is just sort of interesting. And now I'm going to evaluate a model. So I'm going to try to do a logistic regression model to see whether or not I can train it to look at the data and determine whether or not someone is likely to get a CD or not. And I'm going to take my features and label my and run the logistic regression. And I'm going to create a pipeline where I'm going to have the actual prediction for my training data set against the prediction of my of my output. And I'm going to use my logistic regression here and create a model with it, with my training data, evaluating how good that I am of teaching the computer whether or not someone is likely to buy a certificate of deposit based on the data and how I have chosen to format it here. And then I can go ahead and do some predictions. And I can see how good my model is. And here, I predict the probability of no was pretty high. And every single time the actual was no. So it looks like I'm a good guesser, at least 5 records. So I'm going to take a look at all of my predictions. And see how that looks. I'm just showing 5 now. And then I'm going to look at a label of my different counts to see how I was counting. And I didn't do as well as the data predicted, but I wasn't terribly off. So let's take a look at the accuracy of my analysis. And it looks like I got 80% right. So I could create a confusion matrix to further do some analysis on how good my model was. And my model will show me whether or not I was correctly guessing whether the true and the false values here. So I'm creating my confusion matrix and looking at area under the rock. So this is my true positive, my true negative. And if we look at my area under the rock, it's about 80%. So not a bad guess when it comes to looking at doing machine learning. Definitely something that's really easy to do within Azure Synapse. All right, before I get started on this, I want to make sure that I start my SQL pool. So I'll go here and it is paused. I'm going to go ahead and start that so we can take a look at that here in a minute. All right. Data warehousing with provisioned SQL pools. This is the new SQL data warehouse. So this is obviously used for data warehousing. If you don't have at least a terabyte of data, don't bother. It's really not a good fit if you don't have at least that much data. You're charged for every minute that it is in use, but like the rest of Azure Synapse, it is considered a data is separate. So what that means is that when you separate, you can stop it and you don't have to worry about whether or not your data is at risk, because your data is not. You can stop and restart it as much as you want. You also have the ability of changing the underlying compute. If you want it to go faster, you can. You just basically pick another computer and tell it to run on that one. It is completely scalable and separate from your data. There are also people who put this on timers. They know that in the morning they want to have, a lot of people are running reports and they need their data warehouse to be faster, so they use a larger compute. Later in the day, less demand, they change to a smaller compute. You can change the configuration very quickly. Another thing that they did when they added it to Azure GW is they added a lot of performance improvements. Some of the things that they added is that you can actually create pools of users who have high priorities. So you can set it up so the president of your company never has to wait for his query to be done, because if his name comes through, it's automatically gone to the top of the queue. So some of the features that they've added to SQL Pools to help prioritize and classify the different kinds of queries and which ones should be prioritized, in addition to the standard methodologies that was used in the past when you're using data sharding, and that is physically determining where on the disks that your data will be stored. It's got 3 options: hash, round robin, and replicated. And if you have a lot of data like fact tables, you're looking at hash. A smaller table, maybe you replicate it, or maybe you will do a round robin so that they're kind of spread out. So it just sort of depends on how you're accessing your data. And of course, once you have a SQL data warehouse, you can log into it with SQL Server Management Studio. You can access it with your Power BI or other reporting tools like SSRS or paginated reports. So speaking of Power BI, let's talk about how you can integrate Power BI with Synapse. One thing that you can do is that if you are connecting Power BI to provision SQL Pools, the data warehouse, highly recommend that you look at direct query, because you've got that cloud capability, so your access is not bad. Plus, if you got over a terabyte of data, there's no way you can dump all that into Power BI. It's just not built to handle that kind of data. But you could do direct query, and you could also use combined models. So some of your data is imported and your big data is left in the data warehouse, providing a good structure for Power BI to use the data warehouse. All right, let's go ahead and take a look at the demo for this. So I'm going to go ahead, and my SQL pool has been started. So let's take a look at that. I'm also going to create brand new, because I'm going to show you how to do this, link service within Azure Synapse to connect directly to Power BI. And I can go ahead and do that, and then be able to access Power BI from within Synapse. And then, of course, I can make a connection to the data warehouse and build reports from within Power BI. So to do that, to make that connection, the important thing to remember is that you need to be in the same tenant that your Power BI account is in. It also does not work if you have, say, an Outlook account, which I do, but it only works within the same tenant that you have your Power BI in. So keep that in mind. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new link service, and I'm going to connect to Power BI. And within Power BI, you don't just connect to Power BI, you connect to a Power BI workspace. So your link server is actually creating a connection to that. So I happen to know that I have one called Power BI account dev. And notice it picks the tenant. Ta-da. And since it's picked the tenant, it knows which all the workspaces that I have. So I can just go ahead and select one. And I'm going to go ahead, actually, I'm going to actually spell that right. I'm actually going to go ahead and say create. This doesn't take any time at all. And then I have the ability to connect to Power BI. So what I can then do is go to my data, and under my link services here, as soon as it is complete, we'll see if it's now been saved. Then I can go ahead and create a connection to my Power BI link service. So I can go ahead and do that. So I'm going to go to my link services, click on Power BI. Oops. Go ahead and open that up. And I think I just need to refresh so that this is going to behave. There we go. All right. So here is my accounting dev workspace that exists within Power BI. So I can go to Power BI real quick and take a look at that same workspace. And it will go ahead and see my accounting dev workspace. and see that I've got a demo where I am connecting to a data lake. So within Synapse, I can look at my Power BI reports, and I'm going to go ahead and look at my data lake demo. And you can see that it's going to load my data into Azure Machine, right into my analytics workspace within Power BI. And if I did something like created a card to, add some sales information, I don't want first, I want to count all my sales order. So I can go ahead and save this. And as soon as I do, and say refresh, it will exist over here. So you can see that I'm automatically changing it from within my it automatically, when I say save, it will go ahead and do that. So the other thing that I can do is any sorts of edits that are available to me, I can do within here. And it is fully incorporated within my workspace. The other thing that I have available to me is I am actually connecting to my Power BI. Power BI is actually connecting to my data warehouse that I have within Azure Synapse. So all of these are direct querying into the data warehouse so that I have all that functionality available to me. So if I go ahead and open this report within the desktop, you can see that I have a connection to my data. I don't know what that's about. That's connecting to the data lake. So here is my data lake connecting there into Power BI. So with that, that's pretty much what I was planning on showing you today. Kind of a high-level run-through of the different components of Power BI, what you can do with it, what it can do. I didn't get into some of the other features that you can do with it, taking a look at a lot of your different monitoring. It can show you everything that you have done. Integration runtimes are actually also are built in, and this is the Spark engine that is used for running your integration jobs. And you have those as well. Okay, with that, in summary, we did a high-level overview, took a look at everything that you can do within Azure Synapse. We took a look at SQL serverless pools, looking to see how you can use those to access data stored within your data lake. We looked at integration, the ability to integrate ADF-like components within Synapse. We took a look at Spark pools and spent some time walking through a machine learning experiment so you could see that how you could do that within Azure Synapse. And we took a look at server pools, the new Azure DW, allowing you to create a giant database from within Azure Synapse. And then we took a look at adding Power BI to Synapse, adding the functionality so that you could do some querying and analysis on the data that you have from within Synapse, and then publish it out to the Power BI service. And with that, I'd like to thank all of the strategic partners that make all this possible. And I also wanted to say thank you very much. I really appreciated the opportunity to present today, and I hope that you'll reach out on Twitter at DesertIsleSQL if you have any questions that you can't remember to ask me right now. Ooh, the auditorium for the closing session. Yeah, I'd like to go to that. How much of that is in English? I remember from last year. I caught about half of it. Does anybody have any questions? Or feel free to answer. Two things that you might, if you're interested in learning more about Synapse, one thing that I wanted to show you that's super cool, there are all of these great learning things here in the Knowledge Center. So if you create an account, you can go through and browse the gallery, and this is a whole bunch of code that can get you started. Also, Microsoft is having 2 events that are coming up. One of them is coming up tomorrow, and the other one is coming up December 7th. I'm sure that you can find announcements for both of those, and it's talking more about Microsoft's plans with data and with Azure Synapse. So thank you very much. Appreciate the comments. Glad that you were that you got something out of the session. Really appreciate that you hung out for the last session of the day. So
we have some questions.
I do. Any ideas when Azure Workspace will enter GA? You know what? No, but I will say that it's gotten a lot closer, because the one thing that they said that they were going to not do until they were GA is they said that they would have to have source control. Well, they got source control last week, so I think it's closer, but I don't know when it is. Is it better to use ADF within Synapse or standalone? Honestly, from a cost perspective, there's no difference. I guess it depends if you want to do lift and shift SSIS. If that's important to you, stick with the ADF. If you want to integrate notebooks, look at doing it within Synapse. What did I do with that cat on the wall? It's called a Kit Kat clock, and it actually has a tail that goes back and forth, and eyes that go back and forth. Good of you to pay attention. I'm glad you like it. I thought it was cool. Oh, it's hypnotizing. Yeah, you know, the cat was like wandering on my desk, but her tail didn't pop up earlier, so you didn't get to see the actual cat. But I wouldn't stick a real cat on the wall. And thank you so much. I really appreciate you attending.